By the 2000s, investors were telling newspapers that you can't keep cutting to higher and higher profitability. And what we need to see from you is demonstrated growth in advertising and circulation in the top line. And we're more than happy for you to sacrifice your margins to demonstrate that. For the most part, newspapers in the publicly traded sector around the world chose to continue to increase those margins in the last decade. I believe to disastrous effects in stock prices. In 2011, investors are telling us something else. Investors are telling us that we buy into the idea that you are transitioning from news on paper to news media companies, to multimedia news companies. But we need you to demonstrate top-line growth on the digital side, regardless of margin. Frederiksstad Blad is sort of the shining light in the Maycom empire. It's a small newspaper, not big at all. They've got much, much bigger newspapers. But this newspaper took a snapshot of itself in recent years, and they see their revenue model, 90% print, 10% digital, and that's roughly how their staff and resources were allocated. But what they're seeing is this rapid digital growth and this flat print growth. And they basically said, we need to get in front of this. We need to reorganize ourselves where we're going to grow in the future. So they created the 50-50 project. They believe that 50% of their revenues are going to come from digital in the next few years. But they realized that the traditional newspaper way of changing their culture just wouldn't work. So they literally asked everyone to resign and reapply for their jobs. If you're a journalist, you're going to be a print and digital journalist. If you're an advertising sales rep, we're not going to go through this big debate. We're not going to go through the unions. We're not going to go through 5 years of this. And so you're going to reapply to become a multimedia seller. The interesting results of this are that they have seen a rapid increase in digital revenues. They attribute that to this 50-50 project. Print revenues are about the same. But I think the key lesson to take away in this room is they built their culture and they built their company around the path to growth, not where they are today, not where they were yesterday. They had to transform their culture, and they're now rolling this out throughout Europe. What I learned from all of this is that culture trumps strategy. I was slow to realize this. Not 50% of the time, not 75% of the time, 100% of the time. The Toronto Star, at the depth of the last recession, they had to cut like most companies had to cut. But they cut in a smart way. They didn't cut, any company that cuts across the board doesn't know how to manage. The Toronto Star went and said, we're going to cut our newsroom, but we're going to double our investigative staff. We're going to focus on major customers and advertising agencies, but we're going to get out of pre-press, retail classified advertising sales. And we're going to increase marketing expenditures. They see a totally different world in front of us. We see in London the Evening Standard shifting from paid distribution to free distribution. They're seeing their distribution go from 200,000 to 700,000. They're recapturing advertising. They're going to be profitable for the first time in many years in 2012. We see The Independent. The Independent is this odd newspaper that never has quite figured out its role in the world. With new ownership, in fact, they launched a miniature edition, just simply taking almost, I believe, no original content, miniaturizing the content. Their newspaper I now is selling more than the mother newspaper. And they required culture change and an ownership change to see that path. And I'm just giving you examples of creativity, different ways of thinking about what you do, taking your assets and creating new business models for it. The new paper in Singapore, I love this case study. You know, they simply partnered with a sports bar, co-owned the bar, and they now have found new ways to sell subscriptions, new ways to sell sponsors and advertisers. And I think these are just some clever ideas on what you can do with your existing assets. I believe that the alternative to paywalls are ultimately clubs and communities. And across the vast global network of INMA, we're seeing, for example, the Daily Mirror create an English Premier League website that doubled its engagement, doubled its monthly uniques. And they generated money not from a paywall, but from memorabilia and T-shirts and fantasy football and books. I don't believe, in fact, the iPad is a game changer. I'm a bit muted in my response. It's not about the iPad. It's about mobility and engagement, wireless broadband, and the like. Newspapers or news fits onto the iPad. It's just not the killer app. It's up there in the top 5, and we see this in survey after survey. We found that newspapers that jumped into social media in previous years did a lot of automation, and social media can't be about set and forget. The end user has to at least perceive that there's a personal touch, there's a person on the other end of this. We, in fact, sort of have determined, talking with people far smarter than us, that broadly on Twitter and on Facebook especially, about 1/3 of your tweets need to be insights, 1/3 conversation, and 1/3 the general announcements that you're automating right now. We cannot build a product and just assume people are going to read it and engage with it. Newspapers are no longer a destination purchase. You know, back in those days, printing and distributing and producing were important attributes. We're now a very, very discretionary purchase. Where selling and marketing is vital. And I would remind you that a lot of your jobs are about recreating demand for your news products. To conclude, I would say that our survival hinges on changing the culture. You've heard that over and over. Newspaper isn't a dirty word. I think the ethnographic research by News Limited proved that. There are lots of ways to skin the digital cat. I prefer finite communities over paywalls. You find your own way forward. In social media, everyone tweets. The iPad, I think, is not a killer application. I think the next generation might be a killer application. And advertisers ultimately want relevance.